But strong within that charge sheet was the killing of innocents, the punishment of innocents, the deliberate killing of civilians. If one were to use the criteria of the Nuremberg War Crimes Tribunal against the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the arguments would be exactly the same. That you cannot do this. But they did. And the United States is the only country so far to have used nuclear weapons. Weapons of mass destruction, mercifully, have been used only once, but they have been used by the United States, a democratic power, a country whose leaders are elected by civilians democratically, within the limits of that democracy, but that's how they're elected. They're the ones who went along with the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And if you go back and look, all the main newspapers of the Western world, left, liberal, right, supported that bombing. In Canada, in Britain, in Russia, everywhere, that bombing was supported. And it is one of the worst acts, because it was conscious atrocities against us to kill civilians in order to show how strong a weapon is. The citizens of these two cities were treated like guinea pigs. And of course, that introduced the world to the nuclear age. Now, the argument goes that because we live in a nuclear age, world wars are impossible. Well, it is true that world wars on the scale of the First and Second World Wars, in terms of armies fighting each other, are virtually excluded. But I've been thinking about this ever since I was asked to speak here, as to, is it the case that a Third World War, a new world war, is impossible? If you look at why they fight world wars, it's essentially to preserve their influence, their power, their standard of living, their economies, against those who they imagine or think threaten them. Well, that is the basic reason why you had the First and Second World Wars. Now, if you look at the world today, what do we see? We see one single power with overwhelming military strength, the United States of America, whose military budget exceeds those of the next 7 countries after it put together. So militarily, the United States is unchallengeable, cannot be challenged. Economically, however, as some of us have been saying for 5 or 6 years and have been laughed at, the American economy, we argued, in writing, on paper, for the last 10 years, I've been arguing it, and so have many other people on the left, that this was a bubble economy. That this was an economy waiting to implode. That this was a country that was living on debt. And that if, in the case where any third world country behaved like this, and whose levels of debt on every level were so high, the IMF, the World Bank, would be in there like a shot, saying you can't behave like this and we need regime change or we need something. But no one dared say that to the United States. But that is exactly what its economy was. And it's now imploded. That is the way they're moving. Spending billions and billions of dollars which were never available for education, for the health service, for the arts, for anything else you wanted. There was no money. But money is always made available for 2 things. One, to defend the capitalist system, and secondly, to wage war. When they want to do that, they can always find the money. And it is the money of taxpayers. It's your money that goes into waging wars and bailing out the rich. That is essentially what is going on. So everything is up for grabs, but what it also means is that the dominance of the United States now is largely military. There has been a mega collapse of American free market ideology, which is what they were promoting since the collapse of the Russian and now Soviet Union in the 1990s. This ideological collapse reflects something real. So from that point of view, it is a very critical moment in the United States, and I would say North America as a whole, that we need a real big peace movement. Because Obama more or less says it. I can't do anything unless there's pressure from below. He's more or less asking for help sometimes. I can do some things if there's pressure from below, meaning that the state and the structure at the top is so rotten that nothing can be done within its framework unless there is a movement from below. And I have been advising the American anti-war movement to turn up in large numbers at the inauguration, which will probably see more Afro-Americans on the streets of Washington than have ever been seen before. Because if the black population of Washington alone, Washington DC alone shows up, you will have almost 1 million people there, leaving the rest of the country aside. The anti-war movement should be at the inauguration, but carrying banners which both solidarize with what has happened but also move beyond it. And the slogan I've advised is, "Congrats Barack, now out of Kabul and Iraq." So this pressure is really needed, and it's a pressure which can only come from an anti-war movement, from a progressive movement. If it doesn't happen, I do fear for the health and safety both of the United States and the rest of that world, because they are involved in 2 occupations now, in Iraq and Afghanistan. Otherwise, if nothing changes at all, and the rulers of the world carry on as before, they could destroy this world, because they now have the capacity to do so. And they can't stop nuclear proliferation, because people feel, it's an awful thing to say, but many, many small countries feel that the only way to defend themselves is to get nuclear weapons. And for the United States to say, no, you can't, we will determine who can and who can't, is unacceptable to most people. So the United States says, if you're on our side, then you can have nuclear weapons. So India can have them. Israel can have them. China and Russia have got them. They're not totally on our side, but there's nothing we can do about it. Pakistan has got them when it was on our side. And we think it still is, but we're not 100% sure. But nonetheless, let's keep quiet about that for the time being. But Iran can't have them. Well, the Iranians apart from saying they don't want them, but what they argue in private is, we're the ones who've been attacked. We're the ones who the West unleashed Iraq against us to try and topple our regime. We're the ones whose private passenger airliners were knocked out of the sky by the United States during the Iran-Iraq war. We're the ones surrounded by nuclear powers, Israel, Pakistan, India. And you say we can't have them, why? Privately they say that, they don't say it publicly. So, because the nuclear weapons have been used to blackmail the rest of the world now wants them. Now that, from my point of view, is understandable, but nonetheless extremely dangerous. because the more nuclear weapons proliferate, the more the chance is that people will use them. What the Russians did in Georgia, I mean, was not supportable, but of course it was exactly the same behavior as that of the United States. And they used exactly the same arguments, saying we're going to support the Ossetians and the Abkhazians, like the United States said we're going to support the Kosovans. Exactly the same arguments used. And the entire media of the Western world suddenly discovered it was fighting a Cold War all over again, which is not the situation. The Chinese, of course, do things very quietly, but the Chinese have let it be known that they will not tolerate permanent US military bases in Afghanistan on their border. They've told the Pakistanis this, they've told the Iranians this, they've told all the neighboring countries. The Indians who are involved in Afghanistan, we are not going to tolerate this. It's an open provocation to build US bases just on our borders. And the Chinese, like myself, read the NATO magazines very carefully. And NATO ideologues are saying the reason we're in Afghanistan is not much to do with the Afghans, but this is a strategically important country on the borders with China. And in the Pentagon, two war games which they play are known as Taiwan and Tibet. Which way to try and weaken China, to balkanize it? It's not going to happen, by the way. Because the Chinese, I mean, the one thing that that country does have is the advantage of being an old civilization, and they've been through virtually everything over the last 2,500 years. So they know what is coming, and they're prepared for it if it comes. But it would be very foolish if it came. What people who didn't want the Iraq war, or what people who don't want the war in Afghanistan feel, is that very little within official politics speaks for them. And when you have official politics so denuded of people who can speak on behalf of an angry or a disenchanted or alienated population, then it's very difficult for people to just carry on. And I've always argued in Europe, here and in the United States, that you just need 10 strong members of parliament who carry on regardless. It hasn't happened like that. Who make this a central issue. Look, over 1 million people have died in Iraq since the occupation. Over 1 million people. I mean, just imagine if 20,000 Canadians died in some war, or 50,000 Americans. The anger, the rage, punish them, try them as war criminals. It would be so strong. But the double standards that exist all over the Western world is that a Western life is more sacred than the life of someone killed by the West. That essentially is what is going on, and this is what has to be said to people, that it's unacceptable. I look at the papers every day. Strikes in Pakistan, we've killed extremists. Just nonsense. They've killed innocent civilians. Two months ago, the Americans sent in unmanned drones. And they said, we've killed 50 people and we think they're extremists. Even the Pakistan government was forced to say all of them were women and children. The same thing is happening inside Afghanistan. High civilian casualties. No one cares. I mean, a few of us do, but by and large, within the Western world, it's as if these lives don't matter. And when that happens, then you have to say, why bother electing Obama? If to defeat internal racism on one level, but keep it going on another. And so what ordinary people do and who they elect becomes extremely important, because on it depends the future of the world. And that is the only thing that will stop more wars and prevent the world itself from being imploded, which it could be, or exploded, if the same rulers remain in charge as are in charge now. And it is for that reason that having a peace movement, campaigns against war, to mobilize people, to educate people, to talk to ordinary people, is extremely important. Thank you.